Brianna Scott moved into Margaret Collins' house as if it already belonged to her. And the first thing Margaret noticed that morning was not a sound or a confrontation, but a quiet rearrangement of her own life that had already begun without permission. Margaret Collins, 72 years old, stood at the entrance of her kitchen in her home in suburban Ohio, a house she and her late husband had lived in for over 40 years, and she felt an unfamiliar pause in her chest as she saw cardboard boxes lying neatly against the wall where her breakfast nook used to feel open and familiar. Brianna was already inside the kitchen, calmly labeling jars in the pantry with small handwritten stickers, moving with the ease of someone who believed she belonged there completely. Ethan Collins, Margaret's 38-year-old son, stood nearby scrolling through his phone, offering a distracted smile when Margaret finally stepped forward, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. "She's just organizing things to make it easier for everyone," Ethan said casually, not looking up, as Brianna reached into a cabinet and shifted Margaret's coffee mugs into a different order without asking. Margaret did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched Brianna place a set of new glass containers on the counter, replacing the ones Margaret had used for years, and she noticed how quickly the space had begun to reflect someone else's habits rather than her own. The refrigerator door, once covered with family photos and handwritten notes, now had half its surface cleared, as if slowly being prepared for something more uniform and less personal. Brianna hummed softly as she worked, occasionally asking Ethan where she should place certain items, never once directing a question toward Margaret, as if Margaret were simply part of the background rather than the owner of the home. Margaret's eyes drifted to the living room doorway where she could see a small decorative lamp she had kept for decades now moved to a different table, its original place replaced by a modern vase she did not recognize. She remembered how her husband used to say every object in the house told a story, but now it felt like those stories were being quietly rewritten by hands that did not ask for permission. She folded her hands in front of her, steady and still, while Brianna continued to move through the kitchen with quiet confidence, opening drawers, closing them, and adjusting the rhythm of the space as if she had always known how it should function. Ethan finally looked up again and asked if she wanted coffee, his tone light, almost indifferent, as though this was just a normal morning of shared living arrangements rather than a shift in control that Margaret could feel but not yet fully name. Margaret nodded once, not because she agreed with what was happening, but because she was observing, and something in her had already begun to register that the house she had built her life in was slowly becoming unfamiliar one decision at a time. She turned her gaze back to Brianna, who was now placing labels on kitchen shelves, and for the first time, Margaret realized that nothing had been taken from her in a single moment. Instead, it was being taken piece by piece in ways so quiet that anyone who was not paying attention would never notice until it was already complete. 2 days earlier, before the kitchen had fully started to feel like someone else's territory, Margaret Collins had already begun to sense a quiet shift that she could not easily explain. It started on a Thursday morning when she woke up at 6:30 as she always did, expecting the familiar sound of the house settling into its slow routine. But instead she heard footsteps that did not belong to her memory of the home. Downstairs, Brianna Scott was already awake, moving through the kitchen with a sense of confidence that made Margaret pause halfway down the staircase. The coffee maker had been relocated, and the breakfast table had been pushed closer to the window, as if someone had decided that natural light mattered more than the way Margaret had arranged things for years. Ethan Collins was sitting at the counter wearing a casual shirt, speaking softly with Brianna about grocery lists and weekend plans, and neither of them noticed that Margaret had stopped in the hallway just watching them interact as if they had always shared this space in the same way. When Margaret finally entered the kitchen, Brianna greeted her with a warm smile, and said she had already taken the liberty of restocking the refrigerator because the previous arrangement was not efficient for cooking, and she said it with such calm certainty that it almost sounded like a favor rather than an assumption. Margaret thanked her politely, though she did not feel thanked for anything in return, and she noticed that Ethan did not correct anything Brianna had said. Not even when Brianna referred to the house as our place, while discussing where to put the recycling bins. Later that same day, Margaret went into the living room and saw that a framed family photograph had been moved from the mantel to a side shelf, replaced by a decorative plant she did not recognize, and when she asked Ethan about it, he simply said Brianna thought it would make the room feel more open and modern. There was no argument in his voice, only acceptance, as if rearranging memories was a natural part of shared living. Over the next 24 hours, Margaret began to notice more changes that were small enough to be dismissed individually but unsettling when placed together. Her reading chair was moved slightly toward the corner. Her kitchen drawer for utensils had been reorganized, and even the way the pantry was labeled had changed into categories she had never used before. Brianna moved through these changes without hesitation, always explaining them gently as improvements, always framing them as helpful adjustments for everyone, and Ethan always agreed in a way that made it seem unreasonable to question her. Margaret found herself spending more time in her bedroom, not out of anger but out of observation, listening to the rhythm of her own home being quietly rewritten one decision at a time. That evening, she overheard Brianna telling Ethan that it might be better if they eventually consolidated the guest spaces, a phrase that made Margaret pause because it sounded final even though it was spoken casually. Ethan did not respond with disagreement, only a thoughtful silence that lasted too long. Margaret stood behind the hallway wall, unseen, and for the first time she understood that what was happening was not sudden but gradual, not loud but deliberate, and that the house she had built her life inside was being reshaped in ways that no one seemed to consider reversible. Later that same evening, Margaret Collins began to notice a pattern that no longer felt like coincidence, but she still tried to tell herself it was simply adjustment, the kind of natural discomfort that comes when two households try to share the same space. Brianna Scott had taken over the kitchen again, preparing dinner with a level of confidence that made it feel like she had been living there for years instead of days, while Ethan Collins sat nearby reviewing emails on his phone, occasionally nodding without really looking up. Margaret stood at the edge of the dining room watching as Brianna set the table, placing plates in positions Margaret had never used before, insisting that this arrangement made conversation flow more naturally, a statement she delivered with a gentle smile that left little room for disagreement. When Margaret quietly mentioned that she preferred the old setup, Ethan responded without hesitation that Brianna was just trying to make things more comfortable for everyone, and the word everyone lingered in Margaret's mind longer than it should have because it no longer felt clear who that word was meant to include. After dinner, Margaret returned to the living room and noticed that the bookshelf had been reorganized again, this time with her late husband's books moved to the lower shelves and Brianna's decorative items placed at eye level, as if priority in the room had shifted without anyone needing to announce it. She ran her fingers lightly along the edge of the shelf, recognizing how subtle the changes were, each one small enough to justify on its own but together forming something she could no longer ignore. Brianna entered the room shortly after, carrying a folded throw blanket, and casually mentioned that she had ordered new curtains for the front windows because the current ones did not match the updated color scheme she had in mind. Margaret asked gently when the decision had been made, and Brianna answered that it was just part of organizing the home so it could feel more unified, as if unity required replacement rather than addition. Ethan, standing in the hallway, agreed again, saying it made sense if they were all going to be living together long-term, and he said it so casually that Margaret felt the words settle in the room like something already decided. That phrase, living together long-term, stayed with her long after the conversation ended, because she had never been part of any discussion where that conclusion had been formally reached. Later that night, Margaret walked through the house alone, noticing how the silence now felt different, not empty but structured, as if every object had been placed with intention that did not belong to her. She paused in front of the hallway mirror and saw her reflection standing in a space that no longer fully felt like hers. And for the first time she understood that the changes were not random adjustments made out of convenience, but a steady redefinition of ownership disguised as everyday help. That night, after the house finally grew quiet, Margaret Collins remained seated at the edge of her bed for a long time, listening to the faint sounds of a home that no longer felt fully under her understanding. The air felt different now, not because anything visible had changed in that moment, but because everything she had once taken for granted now carried uncertainty. She thought back through the day again, carefully reconstructing each interaction with Brianna Scott and Ethan Collins, searching for the exact moment when her role inside her own house had begun to shift from certainty into question. It did not arrive as a single event, she realized, but as a collection of small permissions she had never been asked to grant. In the kitchen earlier, when Brianna had confidently moved items without hesitation, Ethan had not corrected her. When furniture had been rearranged, he had not questioned it. When decisions were made about shared spaces, he had spoken as though agreement had already been established. Margaret stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. Stopping near the living room where the reorganized bookshelf stood under a soft lamp, she traced her eyes across the shelves again, noticing how her late husband's belongings had been gradually lowered, as if memory itself was being placed into a background position. She tried to recall when exactly Brianna had first started referring to the home as something shared, but the memory was no longer clear, which unsettled her more than the changes themselves. As she moved further into the kitchen, she saw a small notebook resting near the counter that she did not recognize. It contained lists, schedules, and household routines written in Brianna's handwriting, all organized with precise structure, as if mapping out how the home should function moving forward. Margaret did not touch it at first. She simply observed it, understanding that organization was no longer just about convenience, but about control disguised as order. Ethan entered quietly behind her, pausing when he noticed her looking at the notebook. He explained softly that Brianna had created it to help streamline daily life so nothing would feel chaotic. And he said it as if chaos had ever been a problem in a house Margaret had maintained peacefully for decades. Margaret asked when they had discussed creating such a system, and Ethan hesitated just long enough for the silence to answer before he did. He said it was not really a discussion, just something that made sense as they settled into living together. That phrase again settled heavily in the air, as if it carried more authority than anything Margaret could say in response. Brianna appeared moments later, casually placing a mug into the sink, asking if everything felt comfortable so far, and Margaret noticed how the question itself assumed that comfort had already been negotiated. Margaret looked between them, her expression calm but increasingly observant, and for the first time she understood that what was happening was not just rearrangement of space, but a quiet restructuring of decisions. Nothing was being taken forcefully, nothing was being announced, but everything was being gradually redirected toward a version of the home where her voice was no longer required for agreement. And in that realization, Margaret began to understand that the most important changes were never the ones she could point to directly, but the ones everyone else acted as if had already been accepted. On the following morning, Margaret Collins woke earlier than usual, not because of rest, but because her mind had remained unsettled throughout the night, replaying every detail of how her home had begun to feel less like a place she lived and more like a place she was gradually being fitted into as an outsider. When she stepped into the kitchen, she immediately noticed that Brianna Scott had already been awake for some time, moving with quiet efficiency as she prepared breakfast, while Ethan Collins sat at the counter reading messages on his phone with the same relaxed posture he had been using more frequently in recent days. There was a sense of routine forming that Margaret had not been invited to define. Brianna greeted her warmly, asking if she preferred coffee or tea, as if the answer had never already been established over years of living in the same home. Margaret responded politely, choosing coffee, and watched as Brianna adjusted the coffee maker settings without asking, explaining that she had found a better way to balance the strength and temperature for everyone in the house. The word everyone again carried weight, because Margaret was no longer sure who it referred to. As they sat down to eat, Brianna began discussing plans for the week, mentioning appointments, home improvements, and scheduling adjustments that she had already begun organizing in a shared digital calendar that Ethan confirmed he had access to. Margaret listened carefully, realizing that decisions about the household were now being discussed in conversations she was not part of, only informed after they were already in motion. When she asked gently about a planned change to the upstairs guest room, Brianna explained that it would likely be converted into a more functional shared space, because it made sense for long-term living arrangements, and she said it with such calm certainty that it sounded less like a suggestion and more like confirmation of something already decided. Ethan nodded in agreement without hesitation, adding that it would help everyone stay organized, and again the word everyone felt undefined, shifting slightly each time it was used. Margaret remained composed, but inside she began to recognize a pattern that extended beyond furniture or routines. It was the steady removal of uncertainty from decisions she had once been part of. Later that afternoon, Margaret walked slowly through the hallway and paused at the guest room door, noticing a measuring tape placed neatly on the floor along with color samples and notes that Brianna had left behind. The space no longer felt like it was being prepared for guests, but rather being redesigned for permanent purpose that did not include asking for permission. She closed the door gently and stood in silence for a moment, understanding more clearly than before that nothing in the house was being taken abruptly, but instead being reassigned through gradual assumption. When she returned to the kitchen, Brianna was speaking with Ethan about rearranging storage in the garage, and Ethan responded as though it had always been part of the plan. Margaret took her seat slowly, observing how easily decisions now moved forward without resistance, and she realized that the most significant change was not in what had been altered, but in how naturally everyone else behaved as if those changes had always belonged to them. As the days continued, Margaret Collins began to understand that the changes inside her home were no longer isolated adjustments, but part of a consistent direction that she was not being asked to approve. Every morning now followed a similar pattern, with Brianna Scott already active in the kitchen before Margaret even entered the room, as if the household schedule had been rewritten around expectations Margaret had never agreed to. Ethan Collins had also begun to treat certain decisions as already settled, often referencing plans that Margaret was hearing for the first time in passing conversations rather than formal discussions. That morning, as Margaret entered the kitchen, she noticed Brianna reviewing printed documents laid neatly across the dining table, showing layout sketches of the house with notes written in careful handwriting, including labels for each room and suggestions for updated usage. Brianna explained casually that she had been thinking about optimizing the home for better daily flow, and she used the word optimizing in a way that suggested the house was not a shared living space, but a system being improved. Ethan stood nearby, scrolling through his phone, occasionally nodding in agreement without questioning any detail. Margaret remained silent for a moment, observing the papers, noticing how every room in the house was being assigned a function that felt increasingly distant from how she had lived in it for decades. When she finally asked whether any of these changes had been discussed with her, Brianna responded gently that they were still just ideas, but Ethan added that it made sense to plan ahead, since they were all building a stable household together. The phrase building a stable household carried an implication that Margaret was no longer separate from the process, but also no longer central to its direction. Later that day, Margaret found herself in the hallway again, where she noticed that small labels had begun appearing on storage doors and cabinets, each written in Brianna's handwriting, creating a system that organized the home into categories Margaret had never used before. She opened one cabinet slowly and saw that items she had kept in specific places for years had been rearranged into different groupings, and while nothing was missing, everything had been relocated with purpose she did not recognize. Brianna appeared behind her shortly after and explained that she was simply making things easier to find for everyone, and again the word everyone seemed to exclude no one officially, yet somehow did not clearly include Margaret either. Ethan joined them in the hallway and commented that it was actually more efficient this way, especially if they were all going to continue living together in the same space for the foreseeable future. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression calm, but internally she began to register that the language used in the house had shifted in a subtle but consistent way, turning individual decisions into collective assumptions that always seemed to align without requiring her input. As she walked back toward the living room, she noticed a faint sense of unfamiliarity settling into the home, not because anything had been removed, but because everything was being redefined through agreement that had already happened elsewhere without her presence. And for the first time, Margaret began to understand that what was happening was not a series of separate changes, but a coordinated transition where her role was no longer being challenged, but quietly bypassed altogether. One afternoon, Margaret Collins found herself sitting alone in the living room longer than usual, not because she wanted solitude, but because the rhythm of the house had slowly stopped including moments that naturally belonged to her. Brianna Scott had gone out earlier with Ethan Collins to purchase household items, leaving Margaret in a silence that now felt structured rather than peaceful, as if even absence had been planned with intention. When they returned, Brianna immediately began unpacking bags in the kitchen, explaining that she had found more efficient storage solutions for the pantry and bathroom supplies, while Ethan carried in additional containers without questioning their purpose. Margaret observed quietly from the doorway as Brianna labeled each container and assigned it a specific place in the home, speaking aloud as though narrating the organization of a shared system, rather than adjusting the belongings of a single homeowner. When Margaret asked where certain personal items of hers had been moved, Brianna responded politely that they were stored in a safer, more accessible location, and Ethan added that it made sense to centralize things so the household could function more smoothly. The word household now felt heavier each time it was spoken, as if it no longer described a home belonging to one person with guests, but something collectively managed without clear boundaries of authority. Later that evening, Margaret noticed that the dining room table had been reset again, this time with a seating arrangement that subtly shifted her usual place slightly away from the center, and although it appeared insignificant, she understood it was part of a larger pattern of gradual repositioning. Brianna explained that the new arrangement allowed for better conversation flow, while Ethan agreed that it felt more natural for everyone involved. Margaret sat down carefully in the seat assigned to her, noticing how the room looked the same yet felt increasingly unfamiliar in its logic. During dinner, Brianna spoke about upcoming changes to shared routines, including cleaning schedules and meal planning, describing them as ways to ensure stability for everyone living under one roof. Ethan supported each suggestion with quiet approval, often reinforcing Brianna's points without adding alternatives, and Margaret realized that agreement was now forming between them so consistently that disagreement no longer had space to exist. After dinner, Margaret walked slowly through the hallway again, noticing additional small adjustments she had not seen before, including framed instructions placed discreetly near storage areas, and updated labels that extended beyond cabinets into broader sections of the home. Each label seemed to reinforce a structure she had not participated in creating. When Brianna passed by and asked if everything felt comfortable so far, Margaret responded calmly that she was simply observing the changes, and Brianna smiled as if observation itself was part of acceptance. Ethan later mentioned that these adjustments were temporary steps toward making the home feel more unified for everyone. And again, the word everyone carried a quiet ambiguity that left Margaret standing in a space where she was present physically but increasingly absent from decision-making. As the evening settled, Margaret remained seated longer than usual, listening to the quiet sounds of a house that continued to function smoothly without requiring her direction, and she began to understand that what was unfolding was not a series of visible takeovers, but a continuous redefinition of normality that no one else seemed to question. By the following morning, the atmosphere inside Margaret Collins' home had settled into a quiet routine that no longer required her participation in the way it once had. Brianna Scott was already in the kitchen when Margaret arrived, preparing breakfast while speaking softly with Ethan Collins about errands, schedules, and small adjustments to the home's weekly plan. Margaret noticed immediately that there were new printed sheets placed on the refrigerator, each one outlining structured routines for cleaning, meals, and shared responsibilities, all organized in a way that suggested the household now functioned under a system she had never been asked to approve. Ethan stood beside Brianna, casually reviewing one of the schedules and agreeing that it would help keep everything balanced, while Brianna explained that structure was important when multiple people were living together long-term. Margaret stood quietly near the doorway, observing how naturally they spoke about the home as a shared environment with shared authority, while she remained outside the flow of decisions that shaped it. As breakfast continued, Brianna mentioned that she had scheduled a minor reorganization of the upstairs storage space later that week, and Ethan responded immediately that it was a good idea, especially since it would make better use of available room. Margaret asked gently what exactly would be moved, and Brianna replied that it was mostly unused items and personal belongings that could be stored more efficiently elsewhere, framing it as a practical improvement rather than a removal of space that had once held meaning for her. Ethan nodded in agreement, adding that simplifying storage would benefit everyone. And again, the word everyone carried a vague sense of inclusion that Margaret could no longer clearly locate herself within. After breakfast, Margaret walked through the house more slowly than usual, noticing additional changes that had been implemented overnight, including updated labels in closets and newly placed storage bins that aligned with Brianna's organizational system. Nothing appeared chaotic, nothing appeared wrong, and yet everything now followed a structure that did not originate from her own habits or decisions. When Brianna later passed by and asked if she was adjusting well to the new arrangements, Margaret simply replied that she was observing how things were evolving, and Brianna smiled politely, interpreting the response as acceptance rather than quiet evaluation. Ethan later joined them in the hallway and commented that the house felt more efficient already, as if the adjustments had resolved a problem that had previously existed, though Margaret had never experienced the home as needing correction before Brianna's arrival. As the day progressed, Margaret found herself increasingly aware of how conversations about the house no longer included questions directed toward her. Only explanations given after decisions had already been made between Brianna and Ethan. That evening, Margaret sat alone in the living room while Brianna and Ethan discussed future plans for additional updates to shared spaces, and she realized that the structure forming inside her home was no longer simply about organization or convenience, but about establishing a new center of authority that had gradually moved away from her without ever announcing its departure. By the next evening, the quiet structure that had been forming inside Margaret Collins' home had reached a point where it no longer felt like a series of adjustments, but a complete system that operated independently of her presence. Brianna Scott moved through the kitchen with calm precision, preparing dinner while reviewing a digital schedule on her phone, occasionally discussing timing and household coordination with Ethan Collins as if the plan had been finalized long before the conversation began. Margaret sat at the dining table observing in silence as Brianna explained that the following week would include a more detailed reorganization of shared spaces, including the garage and remaining storage areas, and Ethan immediately agreed, saying it would help everything function more efficiently for everyone living there. The word everyone once again floated through the room without clear boundaries, no longer anchored to any specific role Margaret could confidently identify. After dinner, Brianna placed a new set of printed guidelines on the counter, outlining updated household routines that included not only chores and schedules, but also designated areas of responsibility for each person in the home. And Margaret noticed that her own name appeared only once, listed in a general category that did not define authority or ownership. Ethan glanced at the document briefly and said it looked organized, while Brianna explained that structure helped avoid confusion when multiple people shared the same living environment. Margaret asked quietly who had approved the final version of the structure, and the room went briefly silent before Ethan responded that it was simply something they had all agreed on over time, even though Margaret could not recall ever being part of that agreement. Brianna smiled gently and said that sometimes agreements formed naturally through consistency rather than formal discussion, and the statement was delivered in a way that made it sound reasonable, even though it left Margaret without a clear point of reference for when her consent had been included. Later that night, Margaret remained seated in the living room long after Brianna and Ethan had left the space, listening to the faint sounds of movement upstairs while reviewing the changes that had accumulated throughout the house. The furniture arrangement, the labeled storage systems, the scheduled routines, and the shared digital planning had all created a version of the home that functioned smoothly without requiring her input, and yet still included her physically within its boundaries. She realized that nothing had been taken from her in a single moment. Nothing had been announced as a removal of authority, but instead everything had been gradually redefined until her role no longer needed to be acknowledged in order for the system to continue operating. As the house settled into nighttime silence, Margaret understood that what she had been witnessing was not a temporary adjustment to shared living, but a complete restructuring of presence itself, where being inside the home no longer meant being part of its decisions, and where absence of conflict had slowly replaced the necessity of inclusion.